How's it going? I want to thank anybody who watches this, but I really want to know if you guys can share this because we're kind of fighting an uphill battle, and I'll explain why. It's going to be self-evident given what we're talking about here. Now, I was going to do a live stream today, but I kind of ditched that idea because I was finishing writing a blog. By the way, I'm writing now for the Hard News Network. So once my story gets released, which I'm pretty sure it will, I will post the link, and I'll probably discuss it as well in a further live stream. But please share this and any other segments you can, because we are fighting against an establishment media, establishment political class, that they can't accept that we don't believe in failure. We don't believe in failure for society. And what do I mean by that? Well, the New York Times, which claims to post all the news that's fit to print, they claim that they print it too, but that's becoming increasingly rarer. They posted this article yesterday, this op-ed called "Brazil's Democracy Pushed into the Abyss," and it is by a fellow named Mark Weisbrot. And it says the rule of law and independence of the judiciary are fragile achievements in many countries and susceptible to sharp reversals. Brazil, the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery, is a fairly young democracy, having emerged from dictatorship just 3 decades ago. In the past 2 years, what could have been a historic advancement, the Workers' Party government granted autonomy to the judiciary to investigate and prosecute official corruption, has turned into the opposite. As a result, Brazil's democracy is now weaker than it has been since military rule ended. This week, the democracy may be further eroded as a 3-judge appellate court decides whether the most popular political figure in the country, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party, will be barred from competing in the 2018 presidential election or even jailed. There's not much pretense that the court will be impartial. The presiding judge of the appellate panel has already praised the trial judge's decision to convict Mr. Lula da Silva of corruption as technically irreproachable, and the judge's chief of staff posted on her Facebook page a petition calling for Mr. da Silva's imprisonment. The trial judge, Sergio Moro, has demonstrated his own partisanship on numerous occasions. He had to apologize to the Supreme Court in 2016 for releasing wiretap conversations between Mr. da Silva and President Dilma Rousseff as his lawyer and his wife, his wife and children. Judge Moro arranged a spectacle for the press in which the police showed up at Mr. da Silva's home and took him away for questioning, even though Mr. da Silva had said he would report voluntarily for questioning. So then they go into all this stuff where, basically the trial of Lula was one of the prime example of how socialist people in power decide to abandon their socialist principles. And he, a lot of the favors that he got as president, they weren't in his name. There's a reason he's being indicted for money laundering, but the bribe, they say the bribe alleged to have been received by Mr. da Silva is an apartment owned by OAS, but there is no documentary evidence that either Mr. da Silva or his wife ever received title to, rented, or even stayed in the apartment, nor that they tried to accept this gift. Well, that's why you have a straw buyer. I mean, it's very these people are pretending. These are socialists, and Mark Weisbrot, I'll get to who he is as soon as I can. They complain all the time about money laundering and offshore accounts or whatever. Well, it's not like they don't know how to do it themselves. So they're playing dumb here. They're saying, oh well, it really wasn't in his name. So how could it have been his? How could it have been a gift to him? I mean, it would have had to have been transferred to his name. Well, that's not how straw buyers work. The evidence against Mr. Da Silva is based on the testimony of one convicted OAS executive, José Aldemario Pinheiro Filho, who had his prison sentence reduced in exchange for turning state's evidence. So this is a classic defense attorney technique to say that the accomplice who's turned state's evidence is really the criminal and that they're just trying to get a lighter sentence. Well, you know, that's not proof that the evidence is fabricated. According to the reporting by the prominent Brazilian newspaper Folha de Sao Paulo, Mr. Pinheiro was blocked from plea bargaining when he originally told the same story as Mr. Da Silva about the apartment. He also spent about 6 months in pretrial detention. It says the evidence is discussed in the 238-page sentencing document. But this scanty evidence was enough for Judge Moro. In something that Americans might consider to be a kangaroo court proceeding, he sentenced Mr. Da Silva to 9.5 years in prison. The rule of law in Brazil has already been dealt a devastating blow in 2016 when Mr. Da Silva's successor, Ms. Rousseff, who was elected in 2010 and reelected in 2014, was impeached and removed from office. Most of the world, and possibly most of Brazil, may believe that she was impeached for corruption. In fact, she was accused of an accounting maneuver that temporarily made the federal budget deficit look smaller than it otherwise would appear. It was something that other presidents and governors had done without consequences, and the government's own federal prosecutor concluded that it was not a crime. While there were officials involved in corruption from parties across the political spectrum, including the Workers' Party, there were no charges of corruption against Ms. Rousseff in the impeachment proceedings. Mr. Da Silva remains a front-runner in the October election because of his and the party's success in reversing a long economic decline. From 1980 to 2003, the Brazilian economy barely grew at all, about 0.2% annually per capita. Mr. Da Silva took office in 2003 and Ms. Rousseff in 2011. By 2014, poverty had been reduced by 55%. And extreme poverty by 65%. The real minimum wage increased by 76%. Real wages overall had risen 35%. Unemployment hit record lows, and Brazil's infamous inequality had finally fallen. But in 2014, a deep recession began, and the Brazilian right was able to take advantage of the downturn to stage what many Brazilians consider a parliamentary coup. If Mr. Da Silva is barred from the presidential election, the result could have very little legitimacy, as in the Honduran election in November that was widely seen as stolen. That part I can at least agree with. A poll last year found that 42.7% of Brazilians believed that Mr. Da Silva was being persecuted by the news media and the judiciary. A non-credible election could be politically destabilizing. Perhaps most important, Brazil will have reconstituted itself as a much more limited form of electoral democracy in which a politicized judiciary can exclude a popular political leader from running for office. That would be a calamity for Brazilians, the reason, and the world. Well, this is very ironic coming from somebody, Weisbrot, who is basically a puppet researcher for the Venezuelan government. Okay, he's somebody, he's committed to the agenda of Venezuela. He runs this group called the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And he wrote this, and it says, Venezuela, who are you going to believe, the New York Times or your lying eyes? And it says today's report from the New York Times trashes the so he's criticizing the New York Times, the very paper that gives him the platform to spew his retarded rhetoric about Brazil. He trashed them in 2014 about Venezuela. It says one can criticize the decision of the government to block the march from going to hostile territory, but given the continuous presence of violent elements among the protesters and that Venezuela is a country with a very high homicide rate and many armed civilians, it could have been the prudent thing to do. The government also believes with some justification that these protests seek to provoke violence in order to delegitimize the government. Their stated goal is to overthrow the democratically elected government And given that the vast majority of the country is against the protests, he doesn't cite anything over here. There's literally nothing here in terms of statistics. So I don't know what he's talking about. This really is their only chance of getting anywhere. And the government also knows that the media, both national, private, and international, will generally blame them for any violence. In the United States, and especially here in Washington, D.C., you have to get a permit for marches like this, and they are often denied or rerouted. And if you try to defy this, the police will generally beat you and throw you in jail. And these are actually peaceful protests here. As for the violence so far associated with the protests since they started on February 12th, the statistics show that more people have died at the hands of protesters than security forces. So that was in 2014. Um, this guy, he's saying that it's first of all, he says that it destroyed Brazilian democracy that they constitutionally impeached Rousseff. Okay, now no, if there's a process for impeachment and they followed that process and they found her culpable for a crime, that's not unconstitutional at all. That's actually exactly the way the Constitution works. And this is coming from a person. He defends the Venezuelan government that has ripped up the Constitution and rewritten it twice since Chavez came to power in 1999. The first time was, I think, in 2004, and just last year they started doing it again. So he doesn't really have any credibility to rely on. And then he talks about those tapes that were released of Lula talking, and they indicate, and I have here the Guardian from March 17th, 2016, and it says release of taped phone calls between Lula and Rousseff sparks mass protests in Brazil. So now, the shoe's on the other foot. You have the people coming out into the streets and saying they want Rousseff out. It said, let me see here. It says in the most damaging conversation recorded on Wednesday afternoon, Rousseff tells Lula that she is sending him over his ministerial papers in case of necessity. The Brazilian media and opposition have interpreted the remarks to mean that she was giving him the papers quickly so that Lula could show them to police to avoid detention. A notice published on the Presidential Palace website late on Wednesday disputed the opposition's interpretation of the call. It states that Rousseff sent Lula the terms of office for him to sign in case he was unable to attend the swearing-in ceremony to take place in Brasilia at 10 a.m. on Thursday. It also said that the presidency would be pursuing legal action against Moro. So I don't know what that means. That means that basically they were threatening the same judge that was trying him. Threatening in a legal sense. The former president is accused of receiving benefits in kind from construction companies involved in the Petrobras scandal. Prosecutors allege he is the real owner of two luxury properties registered in the names of others. Lula denies the charges. On March 4th, he was briefly detained by police in Sao Paulo and taken in for coercive questioning along with his wife, Marissa Leticia, and his eldest son, Fabio Luis. On his release, a highly emotional Lula told reporters he had felt that he had been kidnapped and questioned why Moro had used such an aggressive tactic when he repeatedly offered to testify over the case. The same day, he also vented his frustrations to Rousseff in another phone call that was secretly recorded by investigators and released by Moro to the press on Wednesday evening. In the recording, Lula lambasted Moro's actions as an unprecedented firework display after Rousseff noted the coincidence of damaging revelations being leaked to the press the day before his detention. Lula added that the prosecutors in charge of the case think that with the press leading the investigative process, they are going to refound the republic. We have a totally cowardly Supreme Court, a totally cowardly High Court, a totally cowardly Parliament, a Speaker of the House who was fucked, the President of the Senate who was fucked. I don't know how many legislators under threat, and everybody thinking that some kind of miracle is going to happen. Notably, however, in that same conversation, Lula also said he would never enter government to protect myself. Mora's decision both to record the conversations between the former and current president, to release them to the press, has come in for extreme criticism, even by those appalled by Lula's decision to join the government. The judge justified the decision by stating that the conversations were in the public interest. Democracy in a free society requires that the governed know what their governors are doing, even when they try to act in the dark. Moro also believes that Lula had advance warning of the raid on March 4th and may have known his phone was tapped. The latest revelations will intensify yet further the political polarization in the country. Then this triggered mass demonstrations against Lula. So intense scenes at Thursday's demonstrations, the police cordon establishing a 50-meter gap between the two groups broke down as anti-government activists broke through the police lines to taunt the other side. I came here for free, they chanted, referring to the widespread allegation that PT supporters are in the pay of government. Fascist, fascist, the government supporters shouted back. Police on horseback moved in on several occasions to restore order as firecrackers exploded and threats were exchanged. So, there's plenty of evidence here. Here we go. So, beside the lack of proofs, Lula's lawsuit suffered many violations. Get to know some of them on the list. So there's plenty of people who say that this conviction was unjust. Okay. Let me see. So most of the sources here are actually on the political left. I see The Intercept. I see France 24, Agência Brazil. But it's known that he did use this farm in Atibaia and a luxury triplex apartment in the seaside resort of Guaraja. So, I think it's going to be rough for us to be able to judge how it's. First of all, I do have a source here from O Global. I don't really have enough time to really delve into it. Maybe we're going to have Simone come back, Simone Bodoni, who is the person that I interviewed back in November when this trial was just going on, or I don't think it had even started at the time. So we're going to get her opinion here, but several things. Now, Weisbrot had claimed that Brazil was a roaring success under Lula and under Rousseff. Now, he claims that everything went to shit in 2014. That after that, it's really, everything's gone bad since then. He doesn't. First of all, by 2014, Lula and Rousseff had both been in power for 11 years. So the recession, whose fault is that? These left economists typically blame government policies for a recession. Well, after 11 years, Lula and Rousseff had to own the recession, and what their actions in the Petrobras scandal and other corruption issues, the Lava Jato, I think that's what it's called, the car wash. Trial. Those things, they undermined the economy. They helped, it helped create this recession in Brazil that took it from being one of the major developing countries in the world back to being kind of this symbol of dysfunctional, this dysfunctional graft and corruption. So. Another thing that they did that shows that they really were failures and that they they did not have the best interests of their citizens in mind, was their decisions to go the whole hog for the Olympics and the World Cup. I think the World Cup must have been in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. And I can tell you that um, you can I'll try to pull one up, but abandoned stadiums, Brazil. So okay, here we go. February 20th, 2017. Brazil's $12 billion Olympic legacy lies in ruins. 5 months after the Rio Games, stadiums are crumbling as cash-strapped nation is left with crippling debts. And, there's actually a quite, I guess it's a powerful image of a swimming pool from the Olympics. And it's just empty. And I think you can actually see exposed girders here. See that? So, these people that they say, well, Lula and Rousseff, they brought real prosperity to Brazil. Not really. When you think about it, what they brought was the illusion of prosperity, and that they did basically they copied the Greek model, but they went on steroids. The Greeks also they brought the Olympics to their country in 2004, and within what was it 5 years, the country completely went bankrupt. This is misprioritization, and I don't care whether it is a socialist or a free market capitalist regime that puts it into place. You cannot use public funds to spend on bread and circuses and expect a healthy economy. And I think, I'm hoping that type of attitude does not become permanent in the U.S. I think that there's a lot of public officials that do it already. So, what they did. By the way, a lot of these stadiums that they built for the World Cup and not the World Series, but the Olympics were constructed on slum zones that the government forcibly broke up. So they would send their police officers to these slums and try to force people out, and then they would come in and knock it all down and build these facilities for an event that lasted for all of what was it 2-3 weeks. I don't know how long the Olympics is. That's what they did. Now that's not the main problem that led to the recession in Brazil, because by 2016 it had already been in a recession. After 2014 it started to downturn, and in 2016 it already was in a recession. So it's not like the Olympics were the cause of this, but they certainly didn't help. One of the main causes of this recession was the mismanagement of Petrobras, which is a largely state-owned oil conglomerate in Venezuela. That's about it. I think the New York Times, by publishing such a dishonest piece of shit like this guy, what was his name again? On the tip of my tongue. Mark Weisbrot. When they have this piece of crap writing columns about how Brazil's democracy is pushed into the abyss. Look, nothing was done illegally to remove Rousseff from office, and nothing was done illegally in order to do the same thing. Nothing was done illegally in order to facilitate the end of the Rousseff government. Okay, and also in when he's complaining about the treatment of demonstrators and how democracy is being subverted now. Well, in 2014, it was saying that those demonstrators in Venezuela were nothing but right-wing trolls, basically. Although in live, they were live people attacking the police or whatever. No, this guy. If the New York Times features him, then they might as well feature Pol Pot. They might as well feature, one of these 20-year-old stuffed animal zoologist majors at a college university, that they should have those people come on uh, and comment on the editorial page of the New York Times. But I'm getting a little groggy, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Please share it and please talk about it and get the conversation going about how these media groups, they definitely they push agendas that don't even make any sense. So talk to you later.